The first writers in residence came to the James Merrill House 25 years ago, shortly after James Merrill's death in 1995. Since then, over 80 writers have visited, staying in his home, a National Historic Landmark, to work on projects of their own. Thanks to Merrill's generosity, the house now belongs to the Stonington Village Improvement Association and is an ongoing inspiration for writers and poets from around the world. For more information, visit our website, jamesmerrillhouse.org. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the 2020 James Merrill House Annual Lecture. It also happens to be our 25th anniversary program. My name is Randy Bean, co-chair of the James Merrill House. I'm pleased to be your host this afternoon. Before we begin, I'd like to make a few brief acknowledgements. After all, this is a team effort. I'd like to acknowledge my co-chair for the James Merrill House, Cynthia Elliott. I'd like to acknowledge past co-chairs of the James Merrill House, Ruth Saunders, Sally Wood, Bill Middleton, and the founding co-chair, Lynn Callahan. I'd like to also acknowledge the head of our program committee, Penny Duckham, who leads the writer in residence selection process, as well as two of our longtime jurors, Dee Aldrich and Willard Spiegelman. I'd also like to acknowledge our longest tenured committee member, Sidney Lynch, who's been on the James Merrill House Committee for 25 years. And I'd also like to thank Laura Matthews, who is in charge of communications for the James Merrill House. The James Merrill House Lecture is an annual event. Recent distinguished Merrill House lecturers have included Mary Jo Salter, Laurie Moore, Claudia Rankin, Jory Graham, Louise Gluck, and Jeffrey Eugenides, among others. Our 2021 James Merrill House lecturer next year will be Marlon James. Unlike past years, this year we are unable to gather in person. Fortunately, with the benefit of technology, we bring the Merrill lecturer to a wider audience in a virtual format. Today, we will be ably supported by Merrill House Program Coordinator and Production Coordinator, Bergen O'Malley. This year, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Carl Phillips. I first met Carl in October 2015 as part of a symposium in James Merrill held on the campus of Washington University in St. Louis, where Carl is professor of English and teaches creative writing, and where James Merrill papers are also held in the university's special collections. Carl has been called one of America's most original, influential, and productive of lyric poets. He earned his BA from Harvard University and an MA in creative writing from Boston University, and is the author of 15 books of poetry and a 4-time finalist for the National Book Award. Carl was elected Chancellor of the American Academy of Poets in 2006, and since 2011 has served as judge of the Yale series of Younger Poets, following in the footsteps of W.H. Auden, James Dickey, Stephen Vincent Benet, and James Merrill himself. Carl's writings have been compared to Wallace Stevens, John Ashbery, T.S. Eliot, and Rainier Maria Rilke, and James Merrill too, I believe. He has been a recipient of numerous fellowships and awards: Guggenheim Foundation, American Academy of Poets, American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Academy of American Poets, and Pushcart. Carl has been known, in his own words, to sing, dance, and cook a few things. I'll let Carl explain that. Let's begin with James Merrill, Carl. Can you share with us how you came to Merrill's work, followed by a reading from Merrill and some of your own works?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor. And my memory of first discovering Merrill's work is through probably out of print by now anthology, the Harvard Anthology of Contemporary American Poetry that Helen Vendler did. There were some James Merrill poems there that I saw. This was before I was really writing my own poems. And I was drawn to them, I think, by something that would turn out to be something that is characteristic, I suppose, of my own work. Complex syntax at times, a fondness for periodic sentences. So, but it was just really a kind of brushing acquaintance with the work, just a handful of poems in the anthology. And it really wasn't until I got sort of transformed into a professor, which I still don't quite feel I am, that I came here to Washington University, that I became much more familiar with Merrill, in large part because there's such a tradition of a connection between Merrill and Washington University.
Great. As noted in the introduction, we first met at the Merrill Symposium at Washington University, where Merrill's papers are housed. Can you share a little bit on the WashU connection with Merrill and how his papers came to be housed there?
Yes, although I fear I don't know the details very well. This was all, I believe, in 1995, shortly before his death. Merrill came and gave a reading here. I had only been here 3 years, and 2 years, in fact. And he, there was a woman named Holly, I don't know her last name, who was the head of special collections at the time. And she asked Merrill if he would consider donating his papers. And he immediately said yes. And apparently he said no one had ever asked him. That's the story that they tell here, that no one had ever asked him. And he was so pleased to have been asked that he said, sure, you can have them all. And I don't know if that's characteristic of what his personality was like or not. I met him for all of 3 or 4 minutes that evening at the party that followed his reading. And I'm afraid I didn't stay on very long because he said he knew that I had studied classical Greek. And I said I had, and he began speaking in classical Greek. And that's not something I can't understand it in that way. It's a dead language. So I'm afraid I told him I had to get a glass of wine. I'd be right back, and I ran away.
Did you want to read something at this time, Carl, or did you want me to ask a few more questions?
No, I will. I thought I'd open with reading a poem of Merrill's, and one of my favorites, and then a couple of my poems, and then we'll just segue back. Does that sound good? So one of my favorites is actually one of his earliest poems called The Black Swan. And I will read it. The Black Swan by James Merrill. Black on flat water, past the jonquil lawns, riding, the black swan draws a private chaos, warbling in its wake, assuming, like a fourth dimension, splendor that calls the child with white ideas of swans nearer to that green lake where every paradox means wonder. Though the black swan's arched neck is like a question mark on the lake, the swan outlaws all possible questioning, a thing in itself like love, like submarine disaster, or the first sound when we wake, and the swan's song it sings is the huge silence of the swan. Illusion, the black swan knows how to break through expectation, beak aimed now at its own breast, now at its image, and move across our lives, if the lake is life, and by the gentlest turning of its neck, transform in time times damage to less than a black plume times grief. Enchanter, the black swan has learned to enter sorrow's lost secret center, where, like a maypole, separate tragedies are wound about a tower of ribbons, and where the central hollowness is that pure winter that does not change, but is always brilliant ice and air. Always the black swan moves on the lake. Always the blonde child stands to gaze as the tall emblem pivots and rides out to the opposite side. Always. The child upon the bank, hands full of difficult marvels, stays forever to cry aloud in anguish. I love the black swan. So I thought a segue and perhaps a slight connection to Merrill would be to read a poem that I wrote many years later called Black Swan on Water in a Little Rain. Seen this way, through that lens where need and wanting swim at random toward each other, away again, and now and then together, he moves less like a swan, black or otherwise, than like any man for whom sex is, or has at last become, an added sense by which to pass ungently but more entirely across a life where, in between the silences, he leaves what little he's got to show for himself behind him in braids of water, green to blue wake of please and don't hurt me, and you can see I'm hurt already. It's a very different Black Swan, but interesting to handle the same image, seems to me. And I'll just end this little segment with this poem here called So the Edge of the World, from my newest book. So the Edge of the World. Back then, we'd fall asleep to the wind at night. The wind was enough. I think we thought sleep meant rescue. And because sleep came easily, always unannounced, we were safe. But if safe, why the need for rescue? And since when does rescue amount variously, now to the forgetting that sleep offers, now to dreams not so predictable distraction, I almost said aloud into the room's dark all around us last night. Though this morning these seem precisely what rescue comes to or can, and my mistake has been in thinking of rescue as something more permanent than hard distraction, sleep's soft, impermanent forgetting. The wind was enough mostly, not always. Not those nights when the wind, as if done at last with forever having been a wind, became all song instead, a song of abandonment, a wordless one. When you abandon a thing, best if you can do so, to do so utterly, without words, yet with an outward tenderness so believable. Why else does it hurt still, even now, the mere idea of singing it? There you go.
Okay. You're a beautiful reader. And I remember that from the 2015 Merrill Symposium, what a wonderful job that you did reading his poems that day. You know, you followed in Merrill's footsteps in serving as judge for the YLE series of Younger Poets.
Yeah.
Many of our audience know that the Merrill House hosts the YLE Younger Poet recipient for a 1-month residency at the James Merrill House every June. Question for you: how has serving as YLE Younger Poet judge kept you engaged with emerging writers?
Well, I guess the most obvious way is that these are all first manuscripts, and although they changed during my time serving as a judge, they removed the restriction that it was only open to people under 40. So now it can be people of any age. But at the time, since it was only people under 40, that meant that I was reading work by young people. Or even if they are over 40, it's still the first manuscript by somebody, even if they're 60. So there's still a new writer. So I guess that's been the way. And also, I had various screeners whom I had selected, and most of those were younger writers early in their careers with 1 or 2 books. And so the conversations we would have with each other are certainly a way to stay in touch with what's going on with younger people. Though I have to admit, the main way that works for me is through my teaching and seeing graduate students who are poets in the making themselves right now.
Wonderful. And we solicited the YLE Younger Poets, a number of the ones who have been here over the years. And in the Q&A session, we have questions that have been submitted by a number of your former recipients. Some of these have arrived even within the last few minutes. So, and you noted something previously, that your original entree into the work of Merrill, I believe, was through Helen Vendler, and she actually did this lecture about 8 years ago here in Stonington. So you follow in her footsteps as well.
Great.
Many different footsteps. Would love to hear about what you've been working on recently, particularly during these challenging and very fraught times, and how that has impacted what you're thinking about, what you're writing about. I follow you on Twitter, and I see a number of the things that you're writing and reading, and very relevant and very pointed, I'd say, a number of them as well.
Yeah, well, I guess I like to think that I've always been a person who I read widely because I still think the best way to become a better writer is to read widely and read some good writing by other people. In terms of the current times, I suppose, I've always thought of, well, I think we may end up talking about this anyway, but I don't think of myself particularly as an overtly political writer, although I think that all writing is political in different ways. And so it's not as if this year, for example, or the past 4 years have made me write differently or write about different things. Nor has it seemed to affect productivity for me. I know some people feel a bit overwhelmed by the whole atmosphere, psychological atmosphere of what's going on, and have been unable to write. But for me, writing has always been a kind of urgency, a way of pushing forward, questing forward. And so in a way, the more pressure there is from life, the more I write in response, as a kind of way of keeping a wedge open where I can sort of see some light at the end of this weird tunnel, maybe. And so, yeah, I suppose that's been the main thing. And as for what I'm working on, I just turned in a new manuscript called Then the War, whose title is a little uncharacteristic for me. So maybe I have been influenced by things going on. That book's coming out in 2022. And I do think that something that's different about that book is that there's a middle section that is essentially an essay, though I've broken it down into prose blocks, that kind of smaller prose blocks. And I'm also writing for Yale University Press, at their request, a book of essays on the writing life. So those are two things I'm working on. I mean, the poetry manuscript is done. The Yale thing is due next summer, to my alarm, because apparently it's going to have 7 or 8 chapters, and I've only written 2. But
Great.
It's only October.
So we'd love to hear from you.
Oh, more poems?
Sorry.
Are we at that portion? Good. I will read some poems. I selected some, and then I'll end up finishing with another poem by Merrill. Okay, so these are all from my book that came out this year called Pale Colors in Tall Field, which is in many ways a book about memory. But I'm going to start with a poem that is, I think, sort of political, and uncharacteristically of me, was written in response to an actual event, to a shooting and some rioting, protesting that occurred after it here in St. Louis. Sorry, for some reason I'm not finding the poem. So instead I'm going to read a shorter poem that is right here in front of me. In fact, you know what? Yeah, sorry. I'm going to read a poem that's right in front of me called Overheard Under a Dark Enchantment. It's very short. Compassion first, we were told. And if that won't work, compassion's shadow, pity, to smooth what's rough. We find just holding the victim's hand lately has been exactly enough. That's a poem that is somewhat related to things going on now, and where compassion figures into things, what the difference is between compassion and pity, maybe just holding someone's hand rather than thinking about compassion or pity could be more to the point. A few days after the last election, I wrote this poem called Tugging the Arrow Out. And this might be a good example of how I do write poems that are political, but not overtly so. I don't know that a person would immediately think that this was about living in the wake of that election. tugging the arrow out. There's a nudging that a living horse will sometimes extend toward a dead one, a nudging not so much against death, what is knowable to a horse but not understandable, but against that space right before loneliness settles in for real, that horses do, it seems, understand. And so that was the first day. The night was what night always is, a black starfish, black according to some for holiness, to others for the limbs themselves, unfurling as if from long sleep or late stiffness, or as when a quiet thing, and very still, starts moving, moves, one stiff black limb at a time. I'm going to read the poem, the title poem called Pale Colors in a Tall Field. Remind me to show you where the horses finally got freed for good, not for the freedom of it or anything like beauty, though their running was for sure a loveliness. I'm thinking more how there's a kind of violence to re-entering unexpectedly a space we've never meant to leave, but got torn away from so long ago, it's more than half forgotten. Not that some things aren't maybe best forgotten, at a certain point at least. I've reached that point in my own life where there's so much I'd rather not remember that to be asked to do so can seem a cruelty almost. Bad enough, some days, that there's memory at all. Though that's not exactly it. It's more what gets remembered, how we don't get to choose. For example, if love used to mean rescue, now it's more gladiatorial, though in the end, more clean. Who said that? Not the one whose face I've described somewhere as the sun at that moment when, as if half unwilling still to pull itself free from the night's shadow grove of losses, it first begins to appear. No, not that one. And not the one whose specialty was making a bad habit sound more excusable by calling it ritual. Since when do names excuse? Wish around for it hard enough, you can always find some deeper form of sadness where earlier, so at least you thought, mere sorrow lay. I'd been arguing the difference between the soul being cast out and the soul departing. So I still believed in the soul, apparently. It was that long ago. This poem is called If It Must Be Winter. Not crowns, not conquest defined in terms of how many fear you or fear to say otherwise. Not by these will you know your own royalty, but in smaller ways, how to the least gesture there's more power than seems reasonable, though it will feel deserved. So I was told, and they have not proved wrong. I've but to open my hand, bees come to it, the slick fur of bees assembling as toward an honor in no way expected, though each time the honor remains mine, as if almost it should, as if certain privileges had to do with destiny. Do I believe that? Do I? My hand a sea, across which the wings of the bees flash like signal flags, whose patterns, instead of translating, I make up my own translations for. I shall do as I please. As a lovely argument can make a difficult truth more clear, if not more sweet. Though is there not a sweetness to clarity that can almost make the truth seem worth it? To say I'm not quite sure makes me no less king here. Sometimes I open my hand and there's no sea at all, just a windy plain. What appear to be dust storms crossing it turn out, on reaching me, to be the disappointments, all of them, that I never intended, each one on horseback, my cavalry, each face raised toward mine as if awaiting command, hungering for it, forgetful or stupid, I can see no difference. Look away from me. I haven't said you can look at me. I'm realizing, by the way, why I couldn't find the other poems in this book is because they're in another book. I'm just going to see how close that book is. Oh, it's too far away. Okay, never mind. I'm going to continue with this book and read a poem called Defiance. It has a reference to Homer, but don't be afraid. You don't have to know anything about Homer. Defiance. Some say the point of war is to make the need for tenderness more clear. Some say that's an effect of war, the way beauty can be. Homer's Iliad, for example, or many centuries later, how the horse's head, to protect it in combat, would be fitted with a chafron, a strip of steel, sometimes mixed with copper, all of it hammer-worked, parts detailed in gold. I love you as I've always loved you, one man says, meaning it to another. That doesn't make love true. This only needs to be troubling if we want it to be. Our minds are as the days are, dark or bright, says Homer, the words like coral bells in a pot made to look like the head of an ancient god, a sea god, moss for seaweed across the old god's face. To believe in ritual in the name of hope, there lies disaster. And turned to him and took his hand, the scarred one. I could feel the scars, little crowns, mass coronation. For by then, all the lilies on the pond had opened. All right, I'm going to read, I guess, one more poem from this book and then finish with the Merrill poem. This poem is called Ghost Choir. And it's the poem that gave me a sense of how to put the book together. You'll see it feels chaotic at first. Sentences don't seem to flow into one another. The point of view keeps changing. And then it gave me the idea to arrange the whole book by having poems. Each time you encounter a different poem, it's from a different point of view. What they are doing, he's doing, I'm doing, we, that kind of thing. It sounds like it could be a mess, but it was the challenge of the book. So this is called Ghost Choir. What injures the hive injures the bee, says Marcus Aurelius. I say, not wanting to hurt another this late should maybe more than count still as a form of love. Be wild, bewilder. Not that they hadn't, of course, known unkindnesses and been themselves unkind. When the willow's leaves back again unfold all along their branches, the branches routinely in turn brushing, then lifting away from the pond's face. It's too late. Last night, I doubted as I have not doubted myself in years. Knowing a thing seemed worthless, next to knowing the difference between many things. The fox from the hounds, persuasion from the trust required to fall asleep beside a stranger, who I am, and how I treated you, and how you feel. So that it almost seemed they'd either forgotten or agreed without saying so to pretend they had. Did you know there's an actual plant called honesty for its seed pods, how you can see straight through? Though they'd been told the entire grove would die eventually, they refused to believe it. The face in sleep, like a wish wasted. To the wings at first a slight unsteadiness, then barely any. What if forgetting's not like that? Instead, stampeding, just a ghost choir of legends and rumors, of the myths forged from memory, what's true and isn't that we make of ourselves and, even worse, of others. not the all but muscular ache, the inner sweep of woundedness. No, not tonight. Say the part again about the bluer flower, black at the edges. I've always loved that part. Skull of an ox, from which a smattering of stars keeps rising. How they decided never to use surrender as a word again. All right, and I'm going to finish with this rather late poem by Merrill. Started with a very early one. This is the last poem in the last book that he published. Well, it was published posthumously. The last book he put together, A Scattering of Salts, was the name of the book. And this poem is called An Upward Look. O heart green acre, sown with salt by the departing occupier. Lay down your gallant spears of wheat, salt of the earth, each stellar pinch flung in blind defiance backwards, now takes its toll. Up from his quieted quarry, the lover, colder and wiser, hauling himself, finds the world turning, toys, triumphs, toxins into this vast facility, the living come dearest to die in. How did it happen? In bright alternation, minutely mirrored within the thinking of each and every mortal creature, halves of a clue approach the earth lights. Morning star, evening star, salt of the sky. First the grave, dissolving into dawn, then the crucial recrystallizing from inmost depths of clear, dark blue. Over to you, Randy.
You're such a wonderful reader, Carl. I think you could make the yellow pages sound mesmerizing.
Well, I don't know about that, but thank you.
Would it be possible to request an encore? Is there anything else, even if you have to find your other book?
Well, I can find it. I just didn't know if it was right for me to get up and leave the screen for a minute.
Well, yeah, because I'm going to actually use this moment to make a little announcement.
Okay, good. And I'll just move along.
So as we mentioned at the outset, the Writers in Residency application process is now open as of October 1st. We're selecting residents for the 2021-2022 residencies. So please visit jamesmerrillhouse.org and /apply to learn more about the Writer in Residence program, and hopefully we'll get as great a set of applicants as we have in past years. For our audience in general, I'd also like to call your attention to our website at jamesmerrillhouse.org to learn more about the Merrill House, its programs, and past and current writers. And Carl will be with us shortly when he
here.
Here he comes.
I'm ready. All right. Well, why don't I read the two poems I was going to read that I couldn't? And that will be the Encore. How's that? So this is from a book called Wild as the Wind. This poem is called What I See is the Light Falling All Around Us. To have understood some small piece of the world more deeply doesn't have to mean we're not as lost as before, or so it seems this morning. Random bees stirring among the dogwood blossoms, a few here and there stirring differently somehow, more like resisting stillness. Should it come to winnowing my addictions, I'd hold on hardest, I'm pretty sure, to mystery. Though just yesterday, a perfect stranger was so insistent that I looked familiar. It seemed easier in the end to agree we must know each other. To his body, a muscularity both at odds and at one with how fragile everything else about him, I thought, would be if I could see inside. What's the word for the kind of loneliness that can feel like swimming unassisted in a foreign language for the very first time. I don't know that word, so I just ended the poem there. And this poem is called Gold Leaf. And it's all an extended fragment. If you're trying to diagram the sentences. There's nothing to diagram, really. Gold leaf. To lift without ever asking what animal exactly it once belonged to, the socketed helmet that what's left of the skull equals, up to your face. To hold it there, mask-like, to look through it until looking through means looking back through the skull, into the self that is partly the animal you've always wanted to be, that, depending, fear has prevented or rescued you from becoming, to know utterly what you'll never be, to understand in doing so what you are, and say no to it, not to who you are, to say no to despair. Which is maybe an encouraging poem in this year that can make one prone to despair. There you have it.
Great.
Come back, Randy.
Thank you. There's a lot to unpack in all of that. I'm going to have to reread those poems many times over. In our remaining time, we have a number of questions that have come in from friends and I guess you call them colleagues of sorts. First question comes from Jim Longenbach, and he has two. The first question is more technical. The second question I'll call more political, but you be the judge of that.
Okay.
The first question is, more than 20 years ago, at least since Pastoral, you have worked consistently with a very short line cutting against very long sentences, lots of clauses and phrases. But you have more recently worked in a much longer line, and these poems are also very beautiful. How is this more recent line working for you? Differently? Similarly?
Good question. Well, differently because it's a different line. I guess what I will say is these sort of evolutions, I suppose, are never deliberate on my part. I think what happens is I kind of routinely, I think most writers routinely get bored with something that they get good at. Or I do anyway. And so, yes, I did used to write these very short lines and the sentences would tumble down the page accordingly. In fact, many poems would be only one sentence, but because they'd been divided up in such small pieces, it sort of was a column going down the page. But I guess I think that I'm very interested in muscularity in poetry, in being able to bring about a sort of palpable rhythm that the reader experiences. And it seemed to me that an easy way to create those movements and torques that I think of as muscular action is the line break. So I thought, I guess at some point I must have thought, what would happen if I didn't have recourse to these shorter lines and had to do longer ones? And I think the challenge becomes how to take, my sentences often have been very dense in their syntax, but with a really long line and not being able to sort of spoon feed the reader with a short line, it seems to me that what's happened is the sentences have become more simple. It's not that there aren't syntactically complicated sentences still, but many of them have become very straightforward sentences that you'd expect in like a Hemingway novel. And I think so I think it's interesting that as I realized the line was longer, it couldn't sustain the weight of so much complexity. So it smoothed out in some way. This is just sort of thinking about it right this minute because I don't have a theory about my own sentences. But that, I think, is the main difference. And I also think that the challenge is sort of similar to making a book without sections. To me, the equivalent of doing a book with many sections is doing very short lines and sort of feeding again the reader. And having a longer line, you have to figure out how is the reader going to pick up on division within the line when you don't have these line breaks telling them. That was a very technical answer, but there's my answer.
And I should add, by the way, that Jim Longenbach was a writer in residence a few years ago, and he liked it so well that he bought a house in Stonington. So that's another reason to apply to the program.
Yes.
And here's the second question from Jim Longenbach. He says, you published a brief but incisive essay a couple of years ago in Poetry magazine about being Black, and as a writer, not Black enough. Can you elaborate?
I can, although I think it's funny that Jim says it was a brief piece, since to me it took forever to write it. But yeah, it's not that long. That essay is called A Politics of Mere Being. And it came about because I have, for most of my career, been told by other Black writers that I am not a Black writer. And when I would ask what they mean, they would say, well, you don't write about Black things. And when I would ask what they mean, they'd say, well, you write about love, sex, morality, things like that. Now, I myself think that those are things that relate to, are relevant to all races, all types of people. So I was a little bothered about that. I also have been thinking about how people are quick, they aren't happy unless they can find a box for you. So the article wasn't just dealing with Blackness, but also how in the beginning people thought, okay, well, there's a queer writer and we'll put him in the queer section. And there was sort of, they didn't really know what to do once a few books came out. And as someone said to me, you seem to have stopped being queer after your second book. I mean, obviously that didn't happen, but I think what they meant is I wasn't writing specifically to a queer subject as they had identified it. But as I say in the article, when I'm walking my dog each morning, I'm also a queer Black man. I'm just not thinking about that all the time. In fact, I'm usually not thinking about it. And so the article was sort of a way to argue for people just being themselves and not having to be labeled, and also being the kind of reader who doesn't sort of see, if you see a picture on the back of a Black poet, suddenly you bring all these things to the poems that, I mean, instead of just being open to, let's see what this person has to say. And let's not say this is necessarily Blackness or not Blackness or queerness or whatever. There should be room for all of it, it seems to me.
I think that's great advice for anyone, writer or anyone in general.
Yeah.
Next question comes from one of the Yale Younger Poet recipients who was here a few years ago, Dee Dwan.
Mm-hmm.
And Dee writes, regarding your time as Yale Younger judge, Stanley Kunitz spoke about the difficulty of having to select a winner from a strong group of finalists. He said, quote, as far as I'm concerned, these finalists are all winners, and I wish the rules of the game didn't require me to make an arbitrary choice. I've always hated the business of ranking poets, unquote. Did you ever feel that way? Or were certain years in which the selection was more difficult to make? Could you say something about the decision-making process?
Yes, I can. I feel like I want to preface it by saying perhaps Stanley Kunitz was more generous of heart than I was, or than I am. I don't know. No, I never felt torn between a whole bunch of manuscripts. What happened almost every single year was that I would read through and be fairly uninterested in what my screeners had found for me. And suddenly something would leap out. I should say the reason I was fairly uninterested is because one of the things I require in a manuscript like this is wilderness and strangeness. I want to be shown the world differently from how I see it all the time. That to me is the point of making art. And So I would see plenty of manuscripts which were very polite and did no harm. But to me, that's not what poetry is about. It's about shaking up expectations and sort of startling and disturbing. So there, in most years, there would be a manuscript that suddenly, it sometimes would be the third one I read, and I think, okay, this seems like the winner, but I've got all these others I should still read first, and I would, but nothing would come close to that particular one. There were a couple of years where the choice was difficult. I received a box. What would happen is the screeners would send me a box of about 45, 50 manuscripts. And if I didn't like any of them, I would ask for more, but I'd never had to ask for more. And then I read this box of about 50 manuscripts and I hated all of them. And I just thought, I don't want to pick any of these. And so I asked for more. And that particular year, when that box came, that was the year that Zui, who was asking this question, his manuscript was there, and immediately it leapt out. So that's happened. And there was another year where I did pick a winner, and I called the person, and they said the manuscript's not available. For some reason, Yale, they hadn't told Yale, or Yale didn't get the message, and so I had to start over. That was tough because I had pinned my hopes on this particular manuscript, but I ended up discovering something else that I was just as excited about. So yeah, it's been a bit of a wild ride. It just ended.
Well, thank goodness that you asked for a second box in the year that Zui was selected, because he was a delight when we had him here in Stonington.
Yes.
This question comes from your friend and colleague, if that's the right word, Willard Spiegelman. Mm-hmm. And Willard asks, you were educated as a classicist and taught Latin in high school in your post-college life. How does your knowledge of ancient languages and culture affect your work as a contemporary poet? And as an extension, do you find that many younger poets are regrettably monolingual?
Regrettably monolingual. Those are good questions. Thank you, Willard. Well, I think for me, the main way in which my studying classical literatures has influenced me as a contemporary poet, it was kind of where I found the thing that I think I've been writing about or from for 30 some years. It was when I studied Greek tragedy as an undergraduate, and I started realizing that what these tragedies have in common is they all are about individual will coming into conflict with societal expectation. And although I didn't know at the time, this is what I'm going to write about, I didn't even know I was going to write. But I believe that's when I started thinking about, what does it mean to simply be yourself and to be condemned by society? Of course, that's something that I should have already been aware I was thinking of, just first of all, as a Black person raised in this country. So being marginalized is sort of a big part of the definition of daily life. But also, though I hadn't come to understand myself being queer at the time in college, I think I was already wrestling with this idea of feeling I have a sense of who I am, but it's not what I've been told is normal. And so I feel as if that was a discovery I made through classical literature. And it's been my whole career since. That's pretty much what I write about. But I also think that studying classical languages has certainly affected how I write sentences. Those are inflected languages. I'm aware that many of my sentences stall verbs in the way inflected languages do. And when I was going to go to get a doctorate, which I did not do, well, I went for a year, then I dropped out proudly. When I was going to get a PhD in classical philology, I had determined that I was going to write my dissertation on the use of language, of syntax in particular, as a way of manipulating the listener. And I was going to do this through the work of Thucydides' histories and through the Latin of Tacitus, and both of whom, in different ways, their language, Tacitus in particular, is often writing under dictatorships where if he were to be direct, he would actually be killed. And so how do you manipulate a sentence in such a way that you get your meaning across, but still fly underneath the radar of the tyrant? So I think that way back then, I was already thinking about language as a form of power and a form of a thing that can be manipulated, but can also manipulate the listener. It was a roundabout answer, but that's my answer.
Well, hopefully we haven't come to that time in our American history yet.
I know.
We have two more questions from both from Yale Younger Poet recipients. So this is from Will Scott, who was many years ago a Yale Younger Poet.
Yes.
He said that in a recent interview, you had said that the poets you most admire are, quote unquote, the ones who never stop emerging, unquote, who keep surprising themselves by evolving in unexpected directions. He goes on to say, while he'd love to hear you talk more about artistic reinvention, the question is, what interests and sources of inspiration have stood the test of time for you as an artist? And are there aspects of poetic form or particular poems or poets or varieties of experience that you keep returning to?
Oh, wow. That's a little tougher than I thought it was going to be there. Well, the first part, what interests or things sort of spur me on to continue surprising myself? I think that's how I'm going to take it. Well, first of all, I read. I devote 4 hours of every evening to reading. And I usually fiction, actually. I read poetry in the day, but fiction at night. And I challenge myself to read very widely in different things that I think I might not like, or just I read about on Twitter or wherever. And I find that gives me ideas, not of what to write about, but often how to write something. And I sometimes it can be at the level of the sentence. Sometimes it can be how a short story is constructed. And I'll think that would be an interesting way to think about a poem sometime. So my reading is a big part of it. I'm also, I don't know, I guess I think that maybe it's just one's character. I'm a very curious person, and I'm also very determined not to stagnate. I think it's easy to do, especially at my age, and especially having a nice job where I teach 1 day a week and live in this ivory tower world. And I didn't want to become like a lot of academics. So I stay very much in touch with, being in the world, even now. I mean, of course, it's with masks and not engaging with other people. But my partner and I drive around the countryside, and I travel around a lot with my dog. And I guess I also feel the need to say, though, I want to keep it all clean. But I think a thing that I find is just as important to keep changing up and engaging with is sex. And I find there's a correlation for me between sexual vitality and vitality as a writer. And and maybe that's because I think writing is a very physical thing itself. So staying in touch with one's body seems important. I'll segue to the second half. But what was the second part? Sorry, Randy.
The second part was, what aspects of poetic form or particular poems or poets or variety of experience you keep returning to?
Oh, yes. Oh, so sort of favorites, I suppose. I mean, there's certain books that I read every single month I read Linda Gregg's first book, Too Bright to See, every month. There's a Yale volume in the series called Navigable Waterways by Pamela Alexander. I believe she won in 1984. I read that book almost every month. It's a book that I've read pretty much since '84 when it first came out. And before its range of, I still am surprised from page to page what she takes on, what she calls a poem. So, you know, I have sort of favorite poets that I'll return to, but I also read certain things seasonally. Like we're coming close to the season when I return to, I usually try to read all of Chekhov's plays. At least the book I have has 5. I think that's all of them. So I'll do something like that. Or there are a couple of series of mysteries that I read, and pretty much every winter. Novels of Barbara Pym. These aren't really poetic things; they're fiction. But sometimes I find it's easier to plunge myself into fiction, because with poetry, I often feel as if I need to be reading it for my job in some way too. Can I use this in class? Could this demonstrate something? And I'll admit, sometimes there's a little competition. I'll be annoyed if I read something and I love it, and I think, well, you know, am I still a good poet? And I don't want to go down that road. So, yeah, I tend to turn to fiction more often.
Right. You know, I think we're at the same age, and I appreciated your point about not stagnating.
Mm-hmm.
I also like your point about not only reading for the what, but for the how of things, how things are said. The final question comes from Yanyi.
Mm-hmm.
And Yanyi, the Yale Younger Poet from a few years ago, and Yanyi asks, what was the most valuable wisdom you brought with you as a Yale Younger judge, and what was the most valuable wisdom you learned in the years you were judging?
One half seems easier than the other half to answer. I think the most valuable wisdom I brought to it was to be open to everything. But I'll admit that that's how I try to be anyway. But yeah, to be open to everything. I will say I also felt as if I'm open to everything, but I'm aware of how the series has been up to now. And I wanted to change it. I wanted to make sure that there was more room for writers of color. There's so many types of people who had not been represented in the series ever, and I wanted to change that. Of course, one is reading these without knowing the authors, so some of that has to be based on what you read in the poems. But so anyway, that's one of the things. It was sort of like a piece of wisdom, but also a sort of goal I set for myself, if that can be said. And what is the wisdom I learned as a result of judging it for 10 years? I guess, I wonder if I already knew this, but I think I came to understand the variousness of contemporary poetry. And of course, I knew it was various. And I know I've said already that I would read a lot of manuscripts that all blurred into the same thing. But there were always enough manuscripts that made me realize, you know, Carl, if you're underestimating the new writing, the younger people, don't do that. They're still capable of surprising you. And that's important. It's another form of not becoming stagnant. As a professor and as a teacher, I want to remember, for me, when I'm teaching my students, I try to remember what it was to be their age. I think I'm pretty good at it. But I think a lot of people lose sight of it, and they lose patience. And so I thought of that when reading through manuscripts, where first manuscripts are often quite messy, but I remind myself that that's how my own first manuscript was. You want to just throw everything in that you've got. You love everything, and you think everything you've got is great, and let's put it all in there. And you can't wait for the world to hear you. So I guess something like that.
Right. Well, the time has flown. I think could listen to you read and talk for hours, but our hour is up. So I'd like to thank you for your time with us today, Carl. Very much enjoyed it. It's been a distinct honor, a personal pleasure. I hope to see you again soon in person, and we wish you the very best. And on behalf of the James Merrill House, I'd like to thank our audience, encourage people to visit us at jamesmerrillhouse.org, and for all of the young writers out there, or writers of all ages, to apply for our upcoming residency. So thank you very much, and good evening to everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
The first writers in residence came to the James Merrill House 25 years ago, shortly after James Merrill's death in 1995. Since then, over 80 writers have visited, staying in his home, a National Historic Landmark, to work on projects of their own. Thanks to Merrill's generosity, the house now belongs to the Stonington Village Improvement Association and is an ongoing inspiration for writers and poets from around the world. For more information, visit our website, jamesmerrillhouse.org. Thank you.